He stood up before the judge even finished speaking. My father, 71 years old, gray suit, the one he wore to every occasion that mattered. Funerals, christenings, the day he sold the house on Maple Ridge without telling my mother. He stood up in the third row of courtroom 4B at the Cook County Circuit Court, pointed his finger at me like I was 17 again and had come home past curfew, and said it loud enough for the stenographer to flinch. Disgrace. You are a disgrace to this family. The judge, Honorable Patricia Callahan, stopped mid-sentence. I watched her reading glasses slide a quarter-inch down her nose. She didn't remove them. She didn't bang her gavel. She just looked at him the way you look at a stain spreading across a white tablecloth. Slow recognition. Then she looked at me. I was standing at the petitioner's table in my dress uniform, Air Force, Staff Sergeant, pressed so sharp the creases could cut paper. My service ribbons sat exactly where they belonged, aligned to the millimeter, because that's the kind of person I am, the kind who measures, the kind who checks twice. The kind who spent 23 years being told she wasn't enough and decided, on a Tuesday afternoon in October, while sitting in a Wendy's parking lot in Schaumburg, Illinois, that she was done. Not angry done, not dramatic done the way a bone finally sets after being broken too many times. Quiet. Permanent. The courtroom went so still I could hear the ventilation system clicking above us. 42 people in that room. My attorney, his attorney, my sister Danielle sitting behind my father with her hand over her mouth, because that's what Danielle does. She covers, she smooths, she makes the ugliness presentable. My brother Kevin wasn't there. Kevin hadn't spoken to me in 4 months. We'll get to that. My father was still standing. The bailiff took a step forward. Judge Callahan raised one finger, just one, and the bailiff stopped. "Sir," she said, "you will sit down. You will not speak again. If you speak again, you will be removed, and I will hold you in contempt. Nod if you understand." He didn't nod. He stared at me, and in that stare was everything I'd grown up inside of. The disappointment that I wasn't Kevin. The confusion that I'd joined the military instead of marrying Todd Ashworth from church when I was 19. The simmering, lifelong irritation that I existed in a shape he couldn't control. He sat down, slowly, like the chair owed him an apology. Judge Callahan turned back to me. "Sergeant Novak, please continue." "My name is Elaine Novak. I'm 41 years old. I'm a staff sergeant in the United States Air Force Reserve, currently assigned to the 928th Airlift Wing at Scott Air Force Base. During the week, I work as a logistics compliance officer for a freight company in Naperville. I have a 9-year-old daughter named Margot, who is afraid of thunderstorms and loves drawing horses. And I have spent my entire adult life being the person in my family who is called last, told least, and blamed first. This is the story of how I walked into a courtroom to claim what was mine and watched my father try to take it from me one final time. It's also the story of how he failed. But I want to be careful about that word, failed, because this isn't a story about revenge. I didn't set out to humiliate anyone. I set out to stand up, literally, in a room full of people who had decided years ago what I was worth, and let the truth do what the truth does when you finally stop protecting people from it. It started with my grandmother. Everything good in my life started with my grandmother. Dolores Ann Novak. Dolly, everyone called her. 89 years old when she died, in a recliner, in her living room on Birch Street in Joliet, with a crossword puzzle on her lap and a cup of Earl Grey gone cold on the side table. The paramedics said it was fast. Her heart just decided it was done, and knowing Dolly, she probably agreed with the decision and didn't argue. She was the only person in my family who didn't argue about things that couldn't be changed. I got the call on a Saturday morning, November. There was frost on my windshield and Margot was inside eating cereal and watching something loud on the iPad. My father's voice on the phone was flat, the way it gets when he's performing composure. Your grandmother passed this morning. Funeral's Wednesday. Wear something appropriate. That was it. No asking if I was okay, no pause for grief, just logistics and dress code. I sat in my car in the driveway for 11 minutes. I know because I watched the clock on the dashboard. I didn't cry. I wanted to, but the cold air was coming through the cracked window, and it felt like something Dolly would have done. She kept her windows open year-round, even in January, even when the wind came off the Des Plaines River and turned her kitchen into a refrigerator. "Fresh air fixes what crying can't," she used to say. I didn't fully believe her, but I sat there and breathed and let the frost settle on my eyelashes and thought about the last thing she ever said to me in person. It was 3 weeks before she died. I'd driven down to Joliet on a Sunday, just me and Margot. We sat at her kitchen table eating butter cookies from a tin, and Margot was showing her a drawing of a horse with wings. Dolly looked at the drawing, then she looked at me. Then she said something I didn't understand at the time. "Elaine, when the time comes, don't let them rewrite the story. You were here. You were always here." I thought she was talking about the drawing, or maybe about visiting. I smiled and said, "Of course, Grandma," and poured more tea. She wasn't talking about the drawing. She was talking about the will, about the house, about the $240,000 in a brokerage account that nobody in my family knew existed except her attorney and, eventually, me. She was talking about 23 years of silence and service and showing up when nobody asked me to. And she was telling me, in the only way Dolly ever told you anything important, sideways and quiet, that she had been paying attention the whole time. But I didn't know any of that yet. Not on that frozen Saturday morning. Not at the funeral, where my father gave a eulogy that mentioned Kevin 4 times and me once, in passing, as the kids. Not at the reception afterward, where Danielle squeezed my arm and whispered, "Nice of you to come," as if I'd flown in from another continent instead of driving 40 minutes from Naperville. I didn't know what was coming. None of us did. But Dolly knew. Dolly had planned it down to the last comma in the trust document. And the thing about a woman like Dolly is that when she decides something, she doesn't announce it. She just lets it happen, the same way weather happens, and then everyone stands around asking how they didn't see the storm coming. I should have known. The signs were all there. My name is Claire Alderman. I was 36 years old the day my grandmother died, and I had been a staff sergeant in the United States Army for 11 years. Before that, I was a terrified 19-year-old girl from Wheaton, Illinois, who signed her enlistment papers at the recruiting station on Roosevelt Road because the alternative was another year of sleeping on a mattress in her father's basement, listening to him tell anyone who would listen that his daughter would never amount to anything worth counting. He said that a lot. Not in anger. That's the part people don't understand. Richard Alderman never raised his voice in rage. He raised it in disappointment, which is a quieter weapon and cuts deeper because it sounds like concern. He would sit at the head of the dinner table, carving whatever my stepmother Danielle had roasted that evening, and he would talk about Kevin's new promotion at the brokerage, Kevin's golf handicap, Kevin's plans to buy a condo in Lincoln Park. Then he would glance at me and say something like, "Claire's still figuring things out." I was 23 and had just completed advanced individual training at Fort Lee. I had graduated second in my class. He said, figuring things out the way you'd describe a dog circling before it lies down. I want to be fair about this. My father is not a monster. He never hit me. He paid for braces and a winter coat every year and drove me to school when the buses were canceled. He was present in the way a piece of furniture is present. You can sit on it. It holds weight. But it never asks how your day was. The problem was simpler and worse than cruelty. My father had a picture in his mind of what his children should look like, and Kevin fit inside it the way a coin fits a slot. Kevin was 6'1", broad, easy with people, had my father's jawline and my father's laugh. He went to the University of Illinois on a partial scholarship and came back talking about derivatives and market exposure, and my father would lean forward at the table with his elbows on either side of his plate and listen like Kevin was revealing the location of buried treasure. I was 5'4", quiet, built like my mother, who left when I was 9 and whose name was not spoken in the house the way certain saints are not depicted in certain churches. Too holy or too profane, I was never sure which. I joined the army because Dolly told me to. Not in those words. Dolly never told anyone to do anything directly. She was my father's mother, Dorothy Alderman, and she lived alone in a yellow brick bungalow on Kenilworth Avenue in Villa Park that smelled like lavender sachets and old newsprint. She had been a bookkeeper for 31 years at a plumbing supply company on North Avenue. She balanced their accounts by hand until 1994, when they finally bought a computer, and then she balanced them by hand anyway and used the computer to check her work. She trusted numbers the way some people trust God, completely and without negotiation. The summer I turned 19, I was sitting on her back porch, watching fireflies drift over her garden. I had just failed 2 classes at community college. Not because I was stupid, but because I couldn't concentrate in a place that felt like an extension of my father's house, another room where I was invisible. Dolly brought out 2 glasses of iced tea and sat in the metal chair next to mine, the one with the green cushion that was slowly disintegrating. She didn't ask about school. She already knew. She said, "Claire, some soil is wrong for certain plants. That doesn't mean the plant is broken. It means you need different soil." I enlisted 11 days later. The Army was my different soil. I discovered that I was good at logistics, which is a polite word for making sure the right things reach the right people at the right time, which is actually the hardest job in any organization, and the one that gets the least credit. I was stationed at Fort Bragg, then Fort Campbell, then deployed to Kuwait for 14 months during a supply coordination mission that I still cannot fully discuss. I earned commendations. I received a meritorious service ribbon. My commanding officer, a lieutenant colonel named Reeves who had the emotional range of a filing cabinet, once told me I was the most reliable NCO in his battalion. He said it without looking up from his paperwork. From Reeves, that was practically a sonnet. None of this mattered at the Alderman dinner table. I would come home on leave, and Danielle would set an extra place, always at the far end, near the kitchen doorway where the draft came through in winter. My father would nod at me the way you nod at someone holding the elevator. Kevin would ask, "So, still doing the Army thing?" And before I could answer, Danielle would steer the conversation toward Kevin's bonus, or the vacation property they were looking at in Lake Geneva. I learned to eat quickly and excuse myself to Dolly's house, where I would sleep in the small bedroom upstairs with the quilt that smelled like cedar. Dolly never asked me to justify my career. She asked me to describe it. How does supply chain routing work across 3 time zones? What happens when a shipment gets mislabeled in the field? She would listen with the same focus she once gave to ledgers, nodding, occasionally asking a question so precise it startled me. She understood systems. I had a bad left knee from a training accident at Campbell, a torn meniscus that healed wrong because I waited too long to report it. because reporting injuries felt like admitting weakness in a family where weakness was the only unforgivable sin. It ached in cold weather. It ached the morning of her funeral. It ached as I stood at the back of the room at the reception, watching my father accept condolences as if Dolly had been primarily his mother and only incidentally my grandmother, and I pressed my weight onto my right leg and said nothing. That was always my role, saying nothing, standing at the edge, watching. Dolly once told me, late on a Thanksgiving night when everyone else had gone home and we were washing dishes side by side, "Quiet is not the same as weak, Claire. Quiet is just where strong people keep their ammunition." I dried a serving platter and put it away, and didn't understand what she meant. I understand it now. The first time my father took credit for something I did, I was 19 years old. It was a small thing, or at least that is what I told myself then. He had been struggling with a property dispute over a parcel of land near Lake Chattooge that Dolly had deeded to him years before a neighbor started building a fence 3 feet over the property line. My father complained about it at every Sunday dinner for 2 months straight. He called the neighbor names. He said he was going to go over there with a shotgun. He said the county was corrupt. He did nothing. I was home from Fort Jackson on leave, and I spent one afternoon at the Blairsville courthouse, pulling the original survey records from 1987. I cross-referenced them with the county GIS maps, printed everything out, highlighted the discrepancies, and left the folder on the kitchen table with a note that said, "Show this to the neighbor. It's clear cut." I drove back to base that evening. 3 weeks later, my mother called to tell me the dispute was resolved. She said my father had gone over there with all the paperwork and laid it out on the neighbor's kitchen table, and the man had agreed to move the fence. My mother said, "Your daddy really handled that well." I waited for her to mention the folder. She didn't. I asked, casually, if my father had said where the documents came from. There was a pause. "He pulled them from the courthouse himself," she said. "Spent a whole afternoon there." I said that was great. I said I was glad it worked out. I hung up and sat on the edge of my bunk in the barracks and stared at the cinder block wall for a long time. My bunkmate, Sergeant Reeves, asked me if I was all right. I said I was fine. I was fine. The second time was bigger. I was 23, newly promoted to specialist, and my father was being audited by the IRS over 3 years of improperly reported income from the farm equipment dealership he co-owned with his brother Dale in Young Harris. He called me in a panic because I had taken accounting courses as part of my military occupational training, and he knew, when it suited him, that I was useful. I spent every night for 2 weeks after my shifts going through his books, reorganizing receipts, building a spreadsheet that reconciled every discrepancy the auditor had flagged. I overnighted the finished package to him with a cover letter I drafted for his accountant to sign. The audit ended with no penalties. My father told the family at Christmas dinner that his accountant had saved his skin. His brother Dale raised a glass. Someone said, "Good thing you hired that guy." My father nodded. I was sitting right there at the table carving the turkey. He looked at me once, briefly, the way you glance at a piece of furniture you have forgotten you own. I carved the turkey. I said nothing. The third time was the one that left a mark. I was 26, a sergeant by then, stationed at Fort Benning and running logistics for a battalion-level field exercise that earned a commendation from the brigade commander. My unit was featured in a short write-up in the Ledger-Inquirer, Columbus's local paper, and someone back in Union County saw it and mentioned it to my father at the farmers' co-op. I know this because my mother told me. She said people had been congratulating him all week. She said he told them, "Well, she's doing all right for herself, I suppose, but it's a desk job, not the real army." She said this like she was relaying something harmless, like the words were weather. I had been coordinating fuel and ammunition supply chains for 1,100 soldiers across a 72-hour simulated combat scenario in the Georgia July heat. 3 of those soldiers had been medevaced for heat injuries, and I had rerouted resupply convoys at 2 in the morning from a command tent that smelled like diesel and red clay. It was not a desk job. But that was not the part that hurt. The part that hurt was, I suppose. She is doing all right, I suppose. As if my entire career was a mildly interesting rumor he had not bothered to confirm. Then there was the public one, the one with witnesses, the one I still feel in my chest when I think about it too long. I was 28. I had been selected for a leadership award at the regional level, and the ceremony was held at the National Infantry Museum at Fort Benning. Families were invited. I sent my parents an invitation 6 weeks in advance. My mother called to say they would come. They drove down from Blairsville 4 hours, and I was grateful. I was so grateful it embarrassed me. The ceremony was dignified and brief. When my name was called, I walked to the front in my dress uniform and received the award from a colonel who shook my hand and said, "Sergeant Whitmore, your service reflects the highest standards of this institution." There was applause. I looked into the audience and found my parents in the 3rd row. My mother was clapping. My father was checking his phone. Afterward, in the reception hall, a lieutenant colonel approached my father to congratulate him on having raised such an accomplished soldier. My father shook the man's hand and said, "Well, we always hoped she'd settle down and start a family, but I guess this'll do for now." He laughed. The lieutenant colonel did not laugh. I was standing close enough to hear every word, holding a glass of water, my award tucked under my arm like a clipboard. I could have said something. I imagined saying something. I imagined turning to my father and listing every document I had filed, every hour I had worked, every commendation I had earned. I imagined my voice calm and factual and devastating. Instead, I took a sip of water. It was lukewarm. I swallowed it and walked away, and stood near the window looking out at the parade field where the grass was turning brown at the edges from the August drought. My knee ached. I pressed my thumb into the side of it through my uniform trousers and breathed. That night, alone in my car in the parking lot of my apartment complex off Victory Drive, I cried for about 4 minutes. Then I stopped, wiped my face with a fast food napkin from the glove compartment, went inside, set my alarm for 04:30, and went to bed. In the morning I got up and went to work and did not mention it to anyone. That was September. October came and everything looked the same from the outside. I still drove the same route to post every morning in the dark, still parked in the same spot 3rd row back, still walked through the same door and sat at the same desk. But something had shifted. I could feel it the way you feel a bone that has finally set after being broken for a long time. Not healed exactly, just locked into place. No longer moving in a direction it was never supposed to move. It happened on a Tuesday. I remember because Tuesdays were when my father called. He had been calling every Tuesday at 7 in the evening for 3 years, ever since my mother passed. And in all that time the calls had followed the same pattern. He would ask how I was doing, and before I could answer, he would tell me how my brother was doing. Kyle had gotten a new truck. Kyle had been promoted to regional manager. Kyle's wife was expecting again. Kyle. And then at some point he would say something about how he wished I had chosen a different path, something more stable, something that made sense for a woman. And I would say nothing, and he would take my silence as agreement, and we would hang up, and I would stand in my kitchen holding the phone and feeling like I had swallowed a stone. That Tuesday, he called at 7 on the dot. I was standing at my kitchen counter eating leftover chicken from a styrofoam container because I had not had time to cook. He started with Kyle. Kyle had just closed on a house in Macon, 4 bedrooms, beautiful yard, the kind of place where you raise a family. Then he said, and this is the part I remember so clearly, I can still hear the specific pitch of his voice. He said, "You know, Elaine, your grandfather would have wanted you settled by now. You are 31 years old. You are not going to be young forever. This army thing, it was fine for a while, but you have made your point. Nobody is impressed anymore." I put down the chicken. I wiped my hands on a paper towel, and I said, "Dad, Grandpa Henry told me once that silence is not the same thing as agreement. Do you remember that?" He paused. I could hear the television in the background. Some game show. I said, "I have been silent for a long time. I think you have mistaken that for something it is not." He said, "What is that supposed to mean?" I said, "It means I am not agreeing with you. I have never been agreeing with you. I have been quiet because I loved you, and I did not want to fight. But I am done being quiet so that you can feel comfortable." He was silent for maybe 5 seconds. Then he said, "You sound like your mother when she was being difficult." And that was it. That was the moment. Not because what he said was the worst thing he had ever said, it was not. He had said worse. But because I suddenly understood with perfect clarity that he was never going to see me. Not because he could not, because he had decided long ago not to. He had looked at me and decided what I was, and nothing I did was ever going to change his mind because he was not looking. He was narrating. He had a story about his family, and I did not fit it. And rather than change the story, he had simply edited me out and replaced me with a character who made more sense to him. The difficult daughter. The stubborn girl. The one who would come around eventually. I was never going to come around. I said good night, Dad, and I hung up, and I stood there in my kitchen, and I was not angry. That is the part that surprised me. For years, I had imagined that the breaking point would feel like rage, like fire, like something dramatic and cinematic. It did not. It felt like putting down something heavy that I had been carrying for so long I had forgotten it was not part of my body. My shoulders actually dropped. I felt them release. My knee stopped aching for the first time in weeks. I washed the styrofoam container and threw it away. I folded the paper towel. I sat down at my kitchen table with a legal pad and a pen, the same kind of legal pad I used for mission planning, and I started writing. Not a letter, a list. Everything I needed to do. The JAG office on post had a captain named Rivera who handled family law referrals, and I had overheard her once telling someone about a civilian attorney in Columbus who specialized in estate disputes and contested property claims. I wrote her name down. I wrote down the filing dates for the Muskogee County Superior Court. I wrote down the name of the forensic accountant my squad leader's wife had used during her divorce. I wrote down the address of the county clerk's office. The list took up 1.5 pages. When I was finished, I looked at it, and I felt the way I felt before a mission brief. Focused. Specific. Every task had a sequence, and a purpose, and a timeline. There was no emotion in it. There was only the work. I folded the list and put it in the inside pocket of my duty bag. Then I went to bed. My alarm went off at 4:30. I got up and went to work, and I did not mention it to anyone. But this time the silence was different. This time it was not exhaustion or habit or fear. This time it was operational. I started on a Tuesday because Tuesdays were my half days. I left Fort Benning at 1300 hours and drove to the Muskogee County Clerk's office on 10th Street. The woman behind the counter had reading glasses on a beaded chain, and she looked at me like I was lost. I told her I needed to pull property records for a residential address in Midland, Georgia. She asked me the parcel number. I did not have the parcel number. She asked me the owner's name. I gave her my father's name. She typed it into the system and turned the screen toward me and said there were 3 properties listed under that name, and did I want all of them? 3 properties. I had known about 2. The house in Midland and the rental duplex on Warm Springs Road that my mother had helped him buy in 2006 with money she inherited from her aunt. I did not know about a 3rd. The clerk printed the records, and I sat down on a plastic chair near the window and read them one by one. The 3rd property was a half-acre lot on Boxwood Drive, purchased in 2014. Listed value $41,000. The year my mother asked him to help her replace the roof on the Midland house, and he told her he could not afford it. The year she took out a home equity line of credit to cover it herself. I folded the printouts and put them in the folder I had brought. The folder was blue. I had labeled it with a single word on the tab. I am not going to tell you the word. It does not matter. What matters is that I drove from the clerk's office to a Kinko's on Veterans Parkway and made 2 copies of every page and put the originals in a manila envelope and mailed them to myself at my on-post address. Redundancy. That was something the Army taught me. Never have only 1 copy of anything that matters. The forensic accountant's name was Dana Trask. She worked out of an office park near Peachtree City, which was a 90-minute drive north. I called her on a Thursday and she answered on the 2nd ring, and I told her my situation. She did not ask me why I wanted to do this. She asked me what documentation I already had. I told her what I had. She said it was a start, but I would need bank statements going back at least 7 years and any joint tax returns my parents had filed. I told her my parents had never divorced but had been functionally separated since 2017, and I did not know if my mother had copies of those documents. She said that was common, and that there were ways to obtain them through the court if necessary once a formal petition was filed. I asked her what her retainer was. She said $2,500. I had that. I had been living on post housing and eating at the DFAC for 2 years, and my savings account had $11,000 in it. I had never spent money on anything that was not necessary. Some of the other specialists bought trucks or took trips to Panama City on long weekends. I bought nothing. I think part of me had always known I was saving for something I could not yet name. I paid the retainer by electronic transfer that evening. Then I called my mother. It was the most careful phone call I had ever made. I did not tell her what I was doing. I asked her questions instead. I asked her if she still had the paperwork from when they bought the duplex. She said she thought it was in the filing cabinet in the spare bedroom. I asked her if she still had copies of their joint tax returns from 2015 through 2019. She said she was not sure, but she would look. I asked her if the house in Midland was in both their names or only his. She went quiet for a moment, and then she said she honestly did not know. She had signed something when they bought it, but she could not remember what it was. I did not push. I thanked her and told her I loved her and hung up. Then I sat in my car in the parking lot outside the barracks, and I wrote down everything she had told me and everything she had not told me. The gaps were as useful as the facts. Over the next 6 weeks, I built the case the way I would build an operations order: objective, situation, execution. I requested leave on 3 separate occasions, always single days, always midweek. I drove to Midland twice while my father was at work, and my mother let me into the house, and I photographed every document in that filing cabinet with my phone. 14 years of financial records, mortgage papers, insurance policies. A handwritten note from 2009 in which my father promised my mother he would add her name to the deed of the duplex. He never did. My mother watched me photograph the documents, and she did not ask me why. I think she knew. I think she had always known that someone would eventually do this, and she had been waiting to see if it would be her or someone else. When I left the second time, she stood on the porch and held my face in both hands and looked at me and said nothing. Her hands smelled like dish soap and lotion. I memorized that smell because I understood that what I was about to do would change everything between us, and I wanted to remember what it felt like before. I filed the petition on a Monday morning in March. The clerk on 10th Street stamped it and handed me the case number, and I wrote it on the inside of the blue folder. I called my mother that night and told her what I had done. She was quiet for a very long time. Then she asked me if I was sure. I said yes. She asked me what would happen now. I told her the truth. I told her there would be a hearing and that a judge would look at the financial records and that everything would be on the record and that Dad would know. She said she understood. Then she said something I had not expected. She said she was relieved. She said it the way someone says it when they have been holding their breath for 20 years and they did not even know they were holding it. My father found out 11 days later when he was served at his office. He called me that evening. I let it ring 4 times before I answered. His voice was low and controlled, the way it always was when he was at his most dangerous. He said one sentence. He said I had made the worst mistake of my life. I said nothing. He waited. I waited longer. Then he hung up. That week he called my brother David. He called my sister Rachel. He called Uncle Pete. He told them all a version of events in which I had gone behind his back and betrayed the family over money. He did not mention the third property. He did not mention the handwritten note. He did not mention the $26,000 my mother had spent maintaining a house that was entirely in his name. He told them I was unstable. He told them the army had changed me. David called me and asked me what I was doing, and I told him I could not discuss it, and he said I was tearing the family apart. Rachel did not call at all. I did not defend myself. I did not explain. I went to work every morning at 0500, and I came back to my room every evening, and I opened the blue folder, and I reviewed the documents, and I prepared. My court date was set for April 19th, 6 weeks away. I had one suit. I had one pair of dress shoes. I had every piece of paper that told the truth. April 19th came in cold and gray. Fort Hood had been warm for weeks, but the morning I drove to Killeen, the wind came down hard and the sky looked like concrete. I had not slept. I had tried, and I had lain in my bunk, staring at the ceiling and running through every document in my head until I could recite the dates and the amounts and the signatures from memory. I got up at 4. I ironed my dress uniform. I had decided against the suit. That decision had come to me 3 days before, sitting in Janet Morales's office while she reviewed the final brief. She asked me what I planned to wear, and I told her I had a navy suit from the outlet mall in Harker Heights, and she looked at me for a long moment, and she said, "You earned that uniform and every ribbon on it, and if you want to walk into that courtroom as who you actually are, then wear it." I thought about it for 2 days. I thought about what my father would say. Then I stopped thinking about what my father would say, because that was the entire point of all of this. I put on the uniform. I checked the ribbons. I checked the creases. I looked at myself in the mirror in the latrine, and I saw a staff sergeant in the United States Army who had served 14 years and deployed 3 times, and I saw a woman who was not shaking. My hands were steady. My jaw was set. I drove to the Bell County Courthouse on East Central Avenue, and I parked and I walked through the metal detectors, and I sat down in the hallway on a wooden bench, and I waited. Janet arrived at 8:15. She had the blue folder and 2 additional folders I had not seen before. She told me the judge was Honorable Margaret Dawson, and she told me Judge Dawson did not tolerate theatrics, and she told me that was good for us. I nodded. My father arrived at 8:32. I know the exact time because I looked at the clock on the wall above the courtroom door when I heard his voice coming down the corridor. He was with David. He was with his attorney, a man named Lester Brooks, who had an office on Rancier Avenue and who had handled my father's business dealings for 11 years. My father was wearing his good gray suit, the one he wore to church on Easter. David was in khakis and a blazer. They came around the corner and they saw me, and my father stopped walking. He stopped completely. He looked at my uniform. He looked at the ribbons and the rank and the name tape that read Hargrove, and his face changed. It went from surprise to something darker, something I had seen before but never directed at me with this much force. He walked toward me. Lester Brooks put a hand on his arm, and my father shook it off. He stood in front of me, and he said, "What the hell are you wearing?" I said, "My uniform." He said, "You are not wearing that in there." I said, "It is what I am wearing." He said, "You are trying to manipulate a judge with a costume, and I am not going to let you embarrass this family." I said nothing to that. David stood 6 feet behind him and looked at the floor. My father leaned in close enough that I could smell his aftershave, the same old spice he had worn my entire life, and he said, "You take that off, or you do not walk into my courtroom." I said, "It is not your courtroom." The bailiff opened the doors at 8:45. We filed in. The courtroom was smaller than I expected. Wood paneling, fluorescent lights, an American flag in the corner that had a small tear near the bottom stripe. Judge Dawson was already seated. She was a woman in her early 60s with short silver hair and reading glasses on a chain, and she watched us enter without expression. My father sat on the left side with Lester Brooks. David sat in the row behind them. I sat on the right side with Janet. There were 4 other people in the gallery. I did not know any of them. Judge Dawson began with preliminary matters. She confirmed the case number. She confirmed the parties. She asked Lester Brooks to present his client's position. Brooks stood, and he was smooth and practiced, and he talked about my father's lifetime of hard work and his 3 properties and his desire to distribute his assets according to his values and his judgment as the patriarch of the family. He said the word patriarch twice. He said my father had provided for his children generously and consistently, and that the petitioner, meaning me, had become estranged due to personal choices, including a military career that had taken her away from the family. He said I had not been present for holidays. He said I had not contributed to family life. He made it sound reasonable. He made it sound like I had simply wandered away and was now wandering back with my hand out. Then it was Janet's turn. She stood, and she was not smooth the way Brooks was smooth. She was direct. She opened the blue folder and she said, "Your Honor, I would like to enter into evidence a series of financial records documenting 26 years of monetary transfers from the petitioner and her late mother to the respondent." Judge Dawson nodded. Janet handed the documents to the clerk. She said, "These records show that between 1997 and 2023, the petitioner's mother, Linda Hargrove, contributed $61,400 to the maintenance, tax payments, and mortgage of the property at 3412 Meadowbrook Lane, a property titled solely in the respondent's name. She said the petitioner herself contributed an additional $14,200 from her military pay beginning in 2009. She said none of these contributions were acknowledged in any proposed distribution. My father shifted in his chair. I watched him. His jaw tightened. Janet continued. She entered the handwritten note. She read it aloud. It was dated March 15, 2001, written in my mother's handwriting, and it said, "Ray has agreed that the Meadowbrook house will go to Elaine when the time comes. This is our agreement." Below it were two signatures, my mother's and my father's. Lester Brooks objected. He said the note was not a legally binding document. Judge Dawson looked at the note for a long time. She looked at my father. She asked him if that was his signature. He did not answer immediately. Brooks leaned over and whispered something. My father said it might be, but he did not remember the context. Judge Dawson removed her glasses. She set them on the bench. She said, "Mr. Hargrove, I am going to ask you once more. Is that your signature?" My father looked at me across the courtroom. His face was red. The vein in his temple was visible from 15 feet away. He stood up even though no one had asked him to stand, and he pointed at me, and he said, "This girl is a disgrace." He said she put on that uniform to try to make me look bad. He said she has been scheming with her mother's memory against her own father, and she should be ashamed. The courtroom went silent. Not quiet. Silent. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, and that was the only sound. Judge Dawson did not move. The clerk did not move. Janet put her hand on my arm under the table, and I did not need it, but I appreciated it. Judge Dawson let the silence hold for 5 full seconds. Then she said, "Sit down, Mr. Hargrove." He sat. She said, "I will not have outbursts in my courtroom." She said Staff Sergeant Hargrove is entitled to wear her uniform, and I will note for the record that her service to this country is not relevant to my decision, but it is not a disgrace. She looked at my father when she said the word disgrace, and he looked away. She ruled from the bench that afternoon. She did not need additional hearings. She awarded me full ownership of the Burnsville property. She awarded me the workshop and everything in it. She awarded me the 1967 Ford Fairlane that my grandfather had rebuilt with his own hands in 1989, and that my father had claimed was a gift to him, despite the title being in Grandpa Earl's name, with a transfer on death designation that named me. She awarded me the savings account at First National Bank of Burnsville, containing $41,800, which my father had attempted to move into a joint account with Donna 3 weeks after the funeral, and which the bank had frozen at Janet's request. She denied my father's claim to the house. She denied his claim to the tools. She denied his counterclaim that I had exercised undue influence over a dying man. She said the evidence of Earl Hargrove's mental competence was overwhelming and well documented by his physician, Dr. Annette Coleman, who had provided a signed affidavit. She said the will was valid and unambiguous, and that the challenge had no merit. My father did not scream again. He sat in his chair, and his attorney whispered something to him, and he nodded once. Donna was behind him in the gallery, and I could hear her breathing, fast and shallow, the way people breathe when they are calculating what this means for them personally. I did not turn around to look at her. I looked at the judge, and I said, "Thank you, Your Honor," and she nodded, and that was it. Outside the courthouse, the October air hit me, and I realized I had been holding my jaw so tight that my teeth ached. Janet walked beside me carrying her briefcase, and she did not say congratulations or anything theatrical. She said, "I'll file the enforcement paperwork tomorrow, and you should change the locks on the Burnsville house this week." I said I would. My father came out of the courthouse 11 minutes later. I know because I was sitting in my truck in the parking lot and I watched the door. He came down the steps slowly, and he looked older than he had looked going in. Not broken, not humbled, just older. The way a man looks when something he assumed would always work has stopped working. Donna was next to him, and she was talking, and he was not listening. His attorney shook his hand on the sidewalk and walked to a silver BMW, and that was the last time I saw that attorney. My father looked across the parking lot and saw my truck. He stood there for a long moment. Then he walked toward me. Donna called after him, and he did not stop. I rolled down my window because I owed him that much. He was my father. He stood 3 feet from the truck door and he said, "You think this makes you right?" I said, "I think Grandpa wanted me to have his house." He said, "Your grandfather was a fool, and you are a fool, and you will lose that house within 2 years because you do not know what it costs to maintain a property." I said, "Maybe." He said, "I am your father." I said, "Yes, sir." He said, "This is not over." I said, "It is." He walked away. Donna followed him. They got into his Dodge Ram and pulled out of the lot, and I sat there for a long time with the engine off. The first call came 3 days later. It was not from my father. It was from my Aunt Patricia, his sister who lived in Rolla. She said, "Cassie, I heard what happened, and I want you to know I think Earl would have been proud of how you handled it." I said, "Thank you, Aunt Pat." She said, "Your father is telling people you hired a crooked lawyer and that the judge was biased." I said, "I know." She said he called me at 10 o'clock last night and asked me to talk to you about selling the house and splitting the money. I said, "What did you tell him?" She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "I told him Earl knew exactly what he was doing, and that Robert needs to stop pretending otherwise." That was the first time in my life I heard anyone in the family say something like that about my father out loud. The second call came 5 days after the ruling. It was from my father. He did not yell. His voice was flat and controlled, the way it got when he was managing something. He said, "Cassie, I have been thinking about this situation, and I believe we can come to an arrangement that works for both of us." He said the house needs a new roof and the furnace is 15 years old, and he did not think I understood the financial burden. He said he would be willing to take the house off my hands for a fair price, and we could put this behind us. I said no thank you. He was quiet. Then he said, "You are making a mistake." I said that is possible. He said your mother would be disappointed in you. I closed my eyes when he said that. My mother had been dead for 9 years, and he had not mentioned her in at least 4. I said, "Goodbye, Dad," and I hung up. Donna called the next morning. She was sweet. She was always sweet when she wanted something. She said, "Cassie, honey, I know things have been tense, but family is family, and your daddy just wants what is best for everyone." I said, "Donna, I appreciate you calling, but the court has made its decision." She said, "Well, I just think it is a shame that money has to come between a father and his daughter." I said, "I agree." She did not know what to do with that, so she said, "Well, all right then," and hung up. I changed the locks on the Burnsville house that Saturday. I drove down from Fort Leonard Wood, and I brought a new deadbolt and a new knob set from the hardware store in Waynesville. The house smelled like Grandpa Earl. Sawdust and coffee, and the faint sweetness of the pipe tobacco he had quit smoking in 2014, but that had soaked into the walls over 40 years. I walked through every room. The kitchen, where he taught me to make biscuits from scratch when I was 8. The living room, where he sat in his recliner and watched Cardinals games, and told me that patience was not waiting. Patience was knowing what you were waiting for. The workshop out back, where every tool hung on a pegboard with its outline traced in black marker, so you always knew where it belonged. I sat on the porch and called my brother Kevin in Fayetteville. We had not spoken since the funeral. He had not come to the hearing. He answered on the fourth ring, and I said, "Kevin, it is Cassie." He said, "I know." I said, "I want to tell you what happened with the will." He said, "Dad already told me." I said, "I imagine he did." Kevin was quiet, and then he said, "Cassie, I do not want to be in the middle of this." I said, "You are not in the middle. Grandpa left you the fishing boat and the savings bonds, and those are yours, and no one is contesting that." He said, "I know." Then he said, softer than before, he said, "Cassie, did Grandpa really say anything about me at the end?" I said, "Yes." I said, "He told me to tell you he was proud of your boys, and that you should bring them to the lake more often." Kevin did not say anything for a long time. Then he said, "Okay." He said, "Okay, Cassie." That was all he said, but it was enough. The family split the way families do. Not cleanly, not all at once. My father's side mostly went quiet. A few cousins sent texts that said things like, "Praying for your family during this difficult time," which meant nothing and cost nothing. Aunt Patricia called me every Sunday for the next 2 months. She told me stories about Grandpa Earl that I had never heard, about how he had worked 3 jobs in 1971 to keep the house, and how he had once driven 14 hours straight to bring my grandmother home from a hospital in Memphis. She said your grandfather loved that house because he nearly lost it, and anything you nearly lose becomes sacred. I wrote that down on a piece of paper and taped it to the refrigerator in the Burnsville kitchen. I kept that piece of paper on the refrigerator for a long time, months. Through the winter, when the pipes in the upstairs bathroom froze, and I spent a Saturday morning with a hairdryer and a wrench learning how old houses talk to you when they are hurting. Through the spring, when I planted rosemary and basil in the window boxes the way Grandpa Earl used to do, even though I had never planted anything in my life and had to watch 4 videos on my phone just to understand what kind of soil to buy. The paper got stained with coffee, and the ink started to blur, but I could still read it. Anything you nearly lose becomes sacred. I thought about that a lot during those months. Not just about the house, about all of it, about time, about the years I had spent keeping my head down and my mouth shut while my father and Darren built their version of the family story, the one where I was a background character, the one where my choices were footnotes and my silence was agreement. I thought about every Thanksgiving I had driven to that house and sat at the table and let someone else say grace over food I had paid for. I thought about every phone call where I heard the tone in my father's voice, that specific flatness, like he was talking to someone he had already decided was not important. And I asked myself the question I had been avoiding for years. Why did I let it go on so long? There is no good answer. Or maybe the answer is so ordinary it does not feel like enough. I loved him. He was my father. I wanted him to see me, and I kept believing that one day he would, and that the seeing would happen naturally, like weather changing, like a season turning. I thought if I was good enough, quiet enough, successful enough, he would look at me the way he looked at Darren, with that warmth, that automatic pride. But the truth is, some people do not look at you differently, no matter what you do. Not because you failed, because they decided who you were a long time ago, and they never revisited the decision. My father decided I was the difficult one when I was 17 years old and enlisted instead of going to the college he had picked. He decided I was the one who left, and from that moment on, everything I did got filtered through that lens. The deployments were not service, They were absence. The promotions were not achievement, they were stubbornness. The uniform was not honor, it was defiance. He never updated the file. I could have fought harder, I know that now. I could have stood in front of him 10 years ago and said, "Look at me. Look at what I have done. Look at who I am." But I also know that fighting for someone's attention is not the same as earning it, and that the difference matters. Grandpa Earl never asked anyone to notice him. He just kept doing the work. He built the fence. He fixed the porch. He drove 14 hours to Memphis. He did not need applause. He needed the people he loved to be safe. I think I inherited that from him, that impulse to act instead of argue, to show instead of tell. The problem is that some people will never watch, no matter how clearly you show them. Aunt Patricia said something to me during one of those Sunday calls that I keep coming back to. She said, "Your father is not a bad man, Cassie. He is just a man who got comfortable being wrong." I sat with that for a long time. Comfortable being wrong. It is such a precise way to describe it. He was not cruel out of malice. He was cruel out of habit. He had been wrong about me for so long that being wrong had become part of his identity, and changing his mind would have meant admitting that 20 years of dismissal were unjustified. That is a hard thing for anyone. For a man like my father, a man who built his self-image on being the head of the family, the one who knew best, it was impossible. Admitting he was wrong about me would have meant admitting he was wrong about himself. I do not forgive him. I want to be honest about that. Not yet. Maybe not ever, in the way people usually mean when they say forgiveness. That clean, bright feeling, that release. What I have instead is something quieter. I understand him. I see the shape of his failure and I recognize it as human. He is 71 years old and he is living in a 2-bedroom apartment in Roseville, and his son, the one he gave everything to, does not return his calls most weeks. I know this because Aunt Patricia tells me. I do not call him. He does not call me. The silence between us is not angry anymore. It is just accurate. It reflects the distance that was always there, the distance he built, and I finally stopped trying to cross. I think the hardest part of all of this was not the courtroom. It was not the moment the judge read the will. It was after. It was sitting alone in Grandpa Earl's kitchen at 11 at night, eating toast, listening to the house settle around me, and realizing that I had won, and it did not feel like winning. It felt like the end of a long illness. The relief was real, but so was the exhaustion. And underneath both was a kind of grief that I did not expect. Grief not for what I lost, but for what was never there to begin with. I had spent my whole adult life believing that somewhere under my father's indifference was love. And maybe it was. Maybe it still is. But love that never shows itself. Love that hides behind pride and resentment and silence. Love that you have to excavate like something buried. That is not the kind of love that keeps you warm. Grandpa Earl's love kept me warm. It kept me warm in Afghanistan when I reread his letters. It kept me warm in that courtroom when every eye was on me and I could feel my father's fury from across the room. It keeps me warm now, in this house, where his handwriting is still on the inside of the cabinet doors, and his coffee mug sits on the second shelf exactly where he left it. He did not love me because I earned it. He loved me because he chose to, every single day, without conditions. That is the difference. That is what I learned. I sat on the porch last Tuesday evening, watching the light lead the sky over Fort Smith. Not the dramatic kind of sunset you see in photographs, just the slow, ordinary kind, where the blue turns gray and then turns something darker, and the streetlights come on, one by one down Garrison Avenue, until the whole street glows amber. I had a cup of coffee in my hands. Grandpa Earl's mug, the one with the chipped rim and the faded outline of a largemouth bass on the side. I drink from it every evening, not because I am sentimental, because it fits my hand right, and the coffee tastes better from something that has been loved for 40 years. There was a cardinal in the dogwood tree, just sitting there, not singing, not doing anything in particular, just being red against the green. I thought about how Grandpa Earl would have pointed at it and said something ordinary like, "Well, there he is again." He never made things bigger than they were. He never made things smaller either. He just saw them, clearly, and let them be what they were. I still wear the uniform some days. Not every day anymore. I transferred to a reserve advisory role 6 months ago. The Army does not need me the way it used to, and I have made peace with that. 22 years is a long time to give to anything. My knees know it. My back knows it. The woman who looks at me in the bathroom mirror in the morning knows it too. She has lines around her eyes that were not there when she shipped out to Bagram the first time. She has gray coming in at the temples, and she has stopped coloring it because, somewhere along the way, she decided that hiding things was no longer something she was willing to do. I think about the courtroom sometimes. Not often, not the way I used to, where it would replay on a loop at 2 in the morning, and I would lie there examining every word, every silence, every flicker of expression on my father's face. Now it comes back gently, like a scene from a movie I watched years ago. I remember the feel of my dress uniform, the weight of the ribbons, the sound my shoes made on that tile floor. I remember Judge Whitfield's face when she read the terms aloud. I remember my father's hands gripping the edge of the table until his knuckles turned the color of bone. But mostly, I remember the quiet afterward. Walking out of the Crawford County Courthouse into the parking lot. The sun was too bright. Denise was beside me, saying something about next steps, and I could not hear her because my ears were ringing the way they used to ring after controlled detonations downrange. I sat in my truck for 11 minutes. I know because I watched the clock on the dashboard. I did not cry. I did not celebrate. I just sat there and breathed and let the fact of it settle into my body like rain soaking into dry ground. The house is mine. The land is mine. Not because I took it from anyone, because a man who loved me decided I should have it, and the law agreed, and no amount of shouting in a courtroom could undo that. My father still lives 14 miles away in the house on Vine Street. We do not speak. He called once, about 4 months after the ruling, and left a voicemail that was 38 seconds long. Most of it was breathing. At the end, he said, "You could have handled this differently." I listened to it twice, and then I deleted it. Not out of anger, out of clarity. Because he was right. I could have handled it differently. I could have given in. I could have folded the way I folded for 37 years of my life, agreeing and apologizing and making myself smaller so he could feel like the biggest thing in the room. I could have handled it differently. I chose not to. Darren sends me a text every Christmas. Just a picture of his kids, no words. I do not know what it means. Maybe he does not either. Maybe that is all right. My mother called last spring. She said she wanted to see the garden. She came on a Saturday and we walked the rows together and she touched the tomato leaves the way you touch something you remember from a long time ago. She did not say she was sorry. She said, "Your grandfather would be proud of these." I said, "I know." We did not hug. We did not need to. Something small and true passed between us, and it was enough. I am not the hero of this story. I want you to know that. I am not standing here telling you that I figured everything out and emerged without damage. I carry damage. I carry the memory of a girl who sat on the stairs, listening to her father describe her as a waste of potential, and believed him. I carry the weight of years spent proving myself to a man who had already decided I would never be enough. I carry the knowledge that I waited too long, that I should have drawn the line years earlier, that every time I let it go, I was teaching him that what he did was acceptable. But I also carry this. I carry Grandpa Earl's voice saying, "The quietest person in the room is usually the one paying the most attention." I carry the look on Judge Whitfield's face when she turned to my father and said, "This court finds no grounds." I carry the sound of my own boots on that courtroom floor, steady and even and unhurried, the walk of someone who has marched through worse and come out standing. If you are listening to this and you recognize something, if there is a voice in your life that has been telling you that you are not enough, that your accomplishments are a disgrace, that your strength is an inconvenience, I want to tell you one thing. You do not have to scream. You do not have to fight. You do not have to prove anything to anyone. You just have to know, quietly, in the part of yourself that no one else can reach, what is true. And then you hold on to it. You hold on to it the way you hold a coffee mug with a chipped rim on a Tuesday evening while the light fades and a cardinal sits in a dogwood tree doing nothing at all except being exactly what it is. That is enough. You are enough. The quiet ones always were.